The cold glare of the officer cut through the air like a blade. The airport terminal bustled with the sounds of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and travelers too absorbed in their own lives to notice the injustice unfolding right in front of them. But for her, time had frozen. She had done nothing wrong, nothing except exist in a world where her very presence was seen as a threat. The officer gripped her passport tightly, flipping through it with exaggerated scrutiny, his expression filled with disdain. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside," the first officer commanded, his voice laced with an authority that carried no justification. She raised an eyebrow, keeping her tone steady. "Is there a problem?" The second officer, a stocky man with a smirk that reeked of arrogance, stepped closer. "There's a big problem," he said, tilting his head as if she were an amusing puzzle he was about to solve. "We have reason to believe this passport is fraudulent. We've seen people like you try to pull this before. People like you." The words landed like a slap. She felt the weight of the accusation settle in her chest, heavy and suffocating. Around her, travelers slowed their pace, their eyes darting toward the commotion. Some whispered, others averted their gaze. No one stepped in. No one questioned why two uniformed officers had singled out one woman, why they had immediately assumed she was a criminal. She let out a controlled breath, refusing to let them see her break. "This passport is valid. I've traveled with it countless times." The first officer scoffed, taking a step forward, his hand inching dangerously close to his belt. "And yet, here we are." His words dripped with unspoken malice, an unshakable certainty that no matter what she said, it wouldn't matter. This wasn't about paperwork. It wasn't about protocol. It was about power, the kind they wielded so carelessly, knowing they could get away with it. The stocky officer turned to his partner with an exaggerated shrug. "You'd think they'd at least try a little harder. Fake documents aren't as easy to slip past us as they used to be." She clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the handle of her suitcase. "I have nothing to prove to you." "Oh, but you do," the first officer shot back, his eyes glinting with something dangerously close to amusement. "Unless you want to escalate this into something much worse." There it was. The unspoken threat, the tightening noose. If she resisted, they would make her regret it. If she complied, they would still find a way to humiliate her. The stocky officer grabbed his radio, his voice casual, almost bored. "We've got a suspicious individual at the checkpoint. Going to need backup." Her stomach twisted. Backup. A show of force. A message. She wasn't just being accused, she was being made into a spectacle. A hush fell over the terminal as more officers approached, their presence sending a ripple of unease through the crowd. People were watching now, their curiosity outweighing their discomfort. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she refused to let them see fear. "Step over here, ma'am," the officer ordered again, his patience wearing thin. She squared her shoulders, exhaling slowly before reaching into her purse. The officers tensed, their hands twitching toward their weapons, their instincts primed for violence at the mere sight of her movement. She ignored them, dialing a number. 1 ring. 2. Then, a deep, commanding voice answered on the other end. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice steady. "I need you to come to the airport. Now." Silence. Then, a sharp inhale. "Which terminal?" "Checkpoint C." "I'm on my way." She hung up, slipping the phone back into her purse with deliberate ease. The officers exchanged a glance, the stocky one letting out a chuckle. "That's supposed to scare us?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Calling your boyfriend isn't going to help you now." She met his gaze, her lips curving into a knowing, unreadable smile. "We'll see about that." Minutes ticked by, thick with tension. The officers shifted on their feet, some of them growing impatient. The air was heavy with expectation, but no one, not a single person in that terminal, was prepared for what happened next. The automatic doors slid open. A team of sharply dressed men in dark suits strode inside, their presence sucking the air out of the room. They moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable. The officers straightened instinctively, suddenly unsure of themselves. Then, the crowd parted. And in walked the United States Attorney General. The most powerful legal figure in the country. Her husband. The officers who had just mocked her, humiliated her, treated her as less than human, stood frozen, their faces draining of color as reality crashed down on them. Silence stretched thick and suffocating. The power dynamic that had been so ruthlessly stacked against her had just flipped in an instant. The Attorney General's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail, every guilty expression, every silent witness. His presence alone carried more weight than any threat those officers had tried to use against her. And then, he spoke. What he said next would send shockwaves through the entire airport. What he did next would end careers, shatter reputations, and ensure that those officers would never wear a badge again. This wasn't just justice. This was reckoning. And every single person in that airport was about to witness it. What happened next left them all in complete and utter shock. Racism has no place in our society. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against discrimination in any form. To our black audience, know that your experiences matter, your voice is powerful, and your dignity is non-negotiable. This story highlights the strength, resilience, and justice that every person deserves. Now, get ready for an intense and gripping story. If you enjoy it, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Enjoy the story. The sun was barely rising over Washington, D.C., casting a soft orange hue across the skyline, reflecting off the glass windows of towering buildings. The city was waking up, but for Camille Thompson, the day had already begun hours ago. She sat at the kitchen island of her modern townhouse, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, sipping her coffee as she scrolled through her tablet. The morning news flashed updates about national security, economic policies, and the ever-growing political tensions that seemed to shape the country. Camille was a woman of presence, graceful, sharp, and unshakably confident. At 38 years old, she had built an impeccable career as a corporate attorney, known for her unwavering dedication to justice. She had a reputation in legal circles as someone who didn't just play the game, she rewrote the rules. But beyond her professional prowess, there was something else that set her apart: resilience. Growing up in a working-class black family in Atlanta, Camille had faced her share of obstacles, each one forging her into the formidable woman she was today. She wasn't just a fighter in the courtroom, she had fought for everything she had. Her education, her respect, her seat at the table. But none of that seemed to matter to the people who only saw the color of her skin. Across from her, her husband, Jonathan Thompson, adjusted his cufflinks, his expression composed but alert. At 45, he was one of the most powerful men in the country, the United States Attorney General. His name commanded respect, his decisions shaped national policies, and his presence alone could silence a room. Yet, at home, he was just Jonathan, the man who knew exactly how Camille liked her coffee, the one who could read the shift in her mood without a single word exchanged. He glanced at her over the rim of his coffee mug. "You're quiet this morning." She set her tablet down, sighing softly. "Just thinking about today. I have a meeting with a new client this afternoon, and then I have to catch my flight." Jonathan nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. "Are you sure you don't want me to send security with you? You know how things are." She met his gaze, a knowing look passing between them. She understood his concern. As a successful black woman in a field dominated by men, Camille had learned to navigate hostility with poise. But things had shifted in recent years. The political landscape had emboldened a certain kind of hatred, the kind that didn't hide behind subtlety anymore. "I'll be fine," she said, offering him a small smile. "It's just a quick trip. I land, I meet the client, I come back. Jonathan didn't argue, but the slight tension in his jaw told her he wasn't convinced. By the time she arrived at the airport later that afternoon, Camille had already checked her emails, finalized her notes for the meeting, and skimmed through the latest legal updates. Her efficiency was second nature, a necessity in a world that constantly demanded more from her than it did from others. She moved through security with the ease of someone who traveled frequently, handing over her passport with a polite nod. The officer on duty, Officer Mark Reynolds, barely glanced at it before narrowing his eyes at her. He was in his early 40s, tall, with a build that suggested years of authority unchecked. There was something in his stare that made Camille's instincts flare, a familiarity. Not because she had seen him before, but because she knew men like him. The ones who thought power was their birthright. The ones who saw a black woman in first class and assumed something wasn't right. She held his gaze, waiting. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Then, without a word, Reynolds turned to his colleague, Officer Bradley Carter, a younger officer with an eager-to-please energy that made Camille's stomach turn. "We got a problem here," Reynolds said, holding up her passport. Carter stepped closer, glancing between Camille and the document. "Looks off," he muttered. Camille's patience was razor-thin. "Excuse me." Reynolds smirked, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that sent a chill through her. "Gonna have to ask you to step aside, ma'am. This passport doesn't look right." The words weren't just an accusation, they were a performance. Loud enough for everyone around them to hear. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto her. Strangers who had no idea who she was, already deciding she was guilty of something. Camille exhaled slowly, keeping her tone even. "My passport is perfectly fine. I've traveled with it many times without issue." "Yeah," Reynolds said, his tone mocking. "Funny, because we've seen your type try to use fake documents before. Happens more than you think." "Your type." The air in her lungs turned sharp. There it was. The confirmation of what this was really about. Not her passport. Not some clerical error. Just them flexing their power. Just them reminding her that no matter how much she achieved, no matter how much respect she commanded, she was still just another black woman they could humiliate. Carter took a step forward. "Let's go." "Step aside." "I will not," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "You have no legal grounds to detain me." Reynolds let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You really want to play that game? Because I guarantee you, you're not gonna like how it ends." Camille clenched her jaw, her pulse pounding. She had spent her entire life knowing exactly how these situations unfolded. How resistance, no matter how justified, was met with force. How men like Reynolds and Carter thrived on the fear they created. Her fingers itched to grab her phone, to call Jonathan. But she hesitated. She didn't want to run to him every time something like this happened. She didn't want to need him to fight battles she had been fighting long before they had met. But this wasn't about pride anymore. This was about power. And she knew exactly how to take it back. She reached into her purse, ignoring the way both officers stiffened as if she were a threat. Calmly, she dialed the number. 1 ring. 2. Then, Jonathan's voice, low, steady, filled with a quiet strength. "Hey, baby," she said, her voice smooth but unmistakably firm. "I need you to come to the airport. Now." The moment she hung up, she saw it. The shift. The unease in Reynolds' expression. The way Carter's posture stiffened. They didn't know who she had called, but something in her tone had changed the game. She didn't look afraid. She looked like a storm waiting to break. And when Jonathan arrived, when he walked through those airport doors with his presence commanding the entire room, when those officers realized exactly who they had just tried to humiliate, that storm was going to tear their entire world apart. The air in the airport terminal felt heavier now. The silence that followed Camille's phone call was thick with unspoken tension, an almost palpable shift that had the officers standing a little stiffer, exchanging fleeting glances they thought she didn't notice. They were starting to feel it, that creeping uncertainty that came when the prey didn't behave the way they expected. Reynolds let out a forced chuckle, trying to reclaim the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. "You really think a phone call is gonna change anything?" His voice carried that same smug arrogance, but there was something new laced underneath it now. A hesitation. Camille didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. She had spent her entire career tearing apart men like him in courtrooms, men who thought that intimidation was their greatest weapon. What they never realized until it was too late was that power didn't come from the ability to make someone afraid. It came from the ability to stand unshaken in the face of it. Carter stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "We're going to need you to come with us to a private screening area." Camille arched an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Reynolds scoffed, waving the passport in the air like it was some kind of damning evidence. "Suspicious travel documents. Standard procedure." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Standard procedure. Funny. I've traveled internationally dozens of times from this very airport, and somehow, I've never been randomly selected for a secondary screening." Carter crossed his arms. "We're just doing our job." "Your job," she echoed, voice cool as ice, "would be to apply these procedures equally to everyone, not just to people who look like me." Reynolds took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, lady, we can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. Either way, you're coming with us." Camille exhaled slowly, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "The hard way? And what exactly does that mean, Officer Reynolds? Are you going to arrest me? Charge me with a crime you haven't even defined?" She let the words hang in the air before she leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice to match his. "Because if that's the route you want to take, I highly recommend you get your union rep on the phone. Right now." For the first time, he blinked. She saw it, the crack. The first sign of fear. And that was when she knew he was realizing his mistake. The commotion had drawn attention. Travelers were staring now, whispering, their eyes darting between her and the officers. A woman near the security checkpoint was recording, her phone slightly tilted, catching every second of the confrontation. It wouldn't take long before the footage started making its rounds on social media. Reynolds clenched his jaw, then turned slightly toward Carter, muttering under his breath. "Get her in the back before this turns into a damn circus." Carter nodded and reached for Camille's arm. She took one step back. "Touch me," she said, her voice low and even, "and that will be the worst mistake you ever make." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Carter's hand froze mid-air. He hesitated, looking at Reynolds for instruction, but before either of them could act, the terminal doors slid open. And everything changed. The energy in the room shifted so fast that it was almost suffocating. A wall of Secret Service agents moved through the airport like a tide, their presence alone sending a ripple of realization through the crowd. Every traveler, every staff member, every uniformed officer stopped. And then, Jonathan Thompson walked in. The United States Attorney General. The most powerful legal figure in the country. The man Reynolds and Carter had unknowingly picked a fight with. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He moved with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who commanded the weight of the law itself. His charcoal suit was crisp, his demeanor composed, but his eyes, those eyes, burned with something dangerous. Reynolds' face drained of color. Carter swallowed hard. And Camille? She just crossed her arms and watched. Jonathan's gaze swept over the scene in an instant, assessing, calculating. His eyes landed on Camille first, checking her, grounding himself, before shifting to the officers. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, quiet. "Would someone like to explain to me," he said, tilting his head slightly, "why my wife is being detained in the middle of an airport?" Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Carter, who seemed suddenly fascinated with his own shoes. Jonathan took a slow step forward. The security agents flanking him didn't move, but their presence alone made the entire airport feel smaller, heavier. His voice was still eerily calm. "No one. That's strange. Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like racial profiling." Carter visibly flinched. Reynolds squared his shoulders, forcing out a laugh. "Sir, with all due respect, we were just following protocol. Routine screening." "Routine screening," Jonathan repeated, his gaze locking onto the officer like a vice grip. "Then tell me, Officer Reynolds, how many first-class passengers have you routinely screened today?" Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, how many?" Jonathan pressed. Silence. Jonathan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You see, that's the problem with people like you. You think you can hide behind procedure, when what you're really doing is exercising your own bias. You see my wife, you see the color of her skin, and you assume she doesn't belong in a place like this. And you," his gaze flicked to Carter, whose face had gone pale, "don't even question it. You just go along with it, because that's the system you've been trained in, isn't it?" Reynolds opened his mouth again, but Jonathan wasn't finished. "Let me be very clear about what's going to happen next." His voice never rose, but somehow, it felt deafening. "You are going to hand my wife back her passport. You are going to apologize. And then you are going to pray that when I leave this airport, I don't decide to personally ensure that you both never work in law enforcement again." Reynolds' entire body tensed. Jonathan took a step closer. "You think I'm bluffing?" The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, as if finally realizing that there was no escape, Reynolds did the one thing no one expected. His lips parted. His hands shook slightly. And then, in front of the entire airport, he finally spoke. And what he said, what he admitted, what he revealed in that moment, would change everything. Reynolds' throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his fingers clenching around Camille's passport. The weight of Jonathan's presence was suffocating, pressing against him like an anvil waiting to drop. Carter, standing beside him, had gone stiff, his eyes darting between his superior and the United States Attorney General, as if calculating just how deep they had buried themselves. But there was no calculating this. No escape. They were trapped in their own arrogance, their own assumptions, and now, there was nowhere left to run. For a long moment, Reynolds didn't say anything. His mouth opened, then closed, his jaw tightening as if the words physically pained him to speak. His authority, the thing he had relied on to shield him from consequence, had just crumbled in front of an audience that wasn't going anywhere. The travelers, the staff, the security personnel, all of them were watching now, waiting for him to either stand his ground or collapse under the weight of his own choices. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his patience razor-thin. "I asked you a question, officer. Are you capable of answering it?" Reynolds let out a breath through his nose, his lips pressing together in a tight line. Then, finally, he spoke. We made a mistake." His voice was strained, the words nearly getting caught in his throat. He exhaled again, looking at Carter briefly before returning his gaze to Jonathan. "There was no reason to detain her." Camille arched an eyebrow, her arms still crossed over her chest. "Excuse me." Her tone was even, controlled, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a blade waiting to be unsheathed. Reynolds clenched his jaw, his knuckles white around the passport. "I said we made a mistake. We shouldn't have stopped you. Your passport is valid." Carter inhaled sharply beside him, clearly caught off guard. It was the first real admission that this hadn't been about protocol, that it hadn't been about a security concern or an irregularity in documentation. It had been about them. About who they assumed she was. And now, they were being forced to say it out loud. Jonathan's expression didn't change. If anything, his silence stretched the moment further, letting them stew in it, making sure the words Reynolds had just spoken were fully absorbed by everyone watching. Then, he extended his hand. "Give it back." Reynolds hesitated, then slowly, begrudgingly, placed the passport into Jonathan's outstretched palm. Jonathan turned it over once, briefly checking it before handing it directly to Camille. "Apologize," he said simply, his tone unreadable. Reynolds' face reddened. His pride, that fragile, pathetic thing, was clearly fighting him, clawing at the back of his throat, refusing to let him yield. But what choice did he have? There was no winning this. Not anymore. His lips pressed into a tight, thin line before he finally forced out the words. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Jonathan's eyes darkened. "No. That's not what I asked for." Reynolds' jaw locked. Carter cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably before stepping forward slightly. I apologize for the mistake," he stammered, his voice shaking just enough to betray his nerves. "It won't happen again." Jonathan's gaze remained steady on Reynolds, waiting. Watching. The older officer swallowed hard, then, finally, let out a slow breath. "I apologize," he muttered, his voice hollow, defeated. It wasn't real, Camille knew that much. It wasn't regret or self-awareness. It was damage control, a desperate attempt to salvage whatever scraps of his career he could still hold on to. But it didn't matter. Because for the first time, someone like him was being forced to acknowledge his wrongdoing, publicly, without a badge to shield him. Jonathan nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then, he took another step forward, closing the space between him and Reynolds until they were almost eye to eye. His voice, when he spoke, was low and controlled. "You should both be very, very grateful that I'm in a good mood today. Because if I weren't..." He let the words trail, letting them hang in the air like a silent, unspoken promise. Reynolds' throat bobbed again. "We were just doing our job," he said, almost desperately now, as if grasping at some final defense. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. "No. You weren't." His voice didn't rise, but it didn't have to. "You were profiling. You saw a black woman in first class, and you assumed she didn't belong. You flexed your authority not because you had a reason to, but because you thought you could. And now, you're standing here, in front of all these people, facing the consequences of that choice." Reynolds flinched slightly. Jonathan took a slow breath, then turned to the surrounding officers. "I want both of them off duty immediately while an internal investigation is launched. If I hear so much as a whisper that either of these men has harassed another passenger between now and then, I will personally ensure that this incident becomes a federal case." The head of airport security, who had been lingering uncomfortably behind the chaos, nodded quickly. "Understood, sir." Jonathan's gaze flicked back to Reynolds and Carter. "Go. Now." For a second, it looked like Reynolds might argue, his pride still trying to claw its way out of the pit it had been thrown into. But then, as if fully realizing that he had no more cards left to play, he gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod before turning on his heel and walking away. Carter followed, his head bowed, his entire body tense with humiliation. Camille exhaled slowly, allowing herself, just for a moment, to feel the weight of what had just happened. The shift. The power balance tipping in a direction it almost never did. Jonathan turned back to her, his expression softening slightly. "You okay?" She looked up at him, the corners of her lips curving into something close to a smirk. "I am now." And with that, they walked away, leaving behind a terminal forever changed, and two officers who had just learned, in the most brutal, unforgiving way possible, that their badges weren't shields against consequences. Not anymore. The atmosphere inside the airport remained dense, charged with an energy that refused to dissipate. The events that had just unfolded hung in the air like a thick fog, wrapping around the terminal, filling every silent glance, every murmured conversation, every barely concealed look of shock, awe, and recognition. The weight of it was not just in what had happened, but in what it meant, not just for Camille, not just for Jonathan, but for every single person who had been watching. The power shift had been seismic, the kind that left cracks in the foundation of unchecked authority. It wasn't just about the way Reynolds and Carter had been forced to back down, forced to choke on their own arrogance in front of the very people they had expected to intimidate. It was about the proof, the undeniable, inescapable proof, that, for once, they hadn't gotten away with it. That their usual tactics, their casual cruelty disguised as protocol, their reliance on the silence of bystanders to keep them immune from consequence, none of it had worked this time. And Camille could feel it, the shift in the air, the whispered conversations rippling through the travelers who had stood there and witnessed it all. Some were still trying to process it, their gazes flickering between her and Jonathan as if unable to reconcile the image of a woman they had assumed to be powerless with the reality of the force she truly was. Others were more direct, their quiet nods of acknowledgement, their subtle glances filled with something that resembled admiration, respect, solidarity. But Camille didn't revel in any of it. She didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel victorious, didn't even feel relieved. Because this wasn't a battle she should have had to fight. Not today. Not ever. Jonathan walked beside her, his movements deliberate, controlled, but she could still see it, the way his jaw remained tight, the way his hands flexed slightly, as if trying to force himself to let go of the simmering rage still sitting just beneath the surface. He had played his role perfectly, had wielded his authority like a weapon only when necessary, had stripped those men of their power with nothing but his words, his presence, his unshakable certainty that they had no ground to stand on. But Camille knew him better than anyone, knew exactly what it had cost him to keep himself in check. She inhaled deeply, feeling the last remnants of tension still clinging to her, refusing to be shaken off entirely. "You didn't have to come all the way down here," she finally said, her voice steady, though laced with something softer now, quieter, but just as firm. Jonathan turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes studying her with that same intensity that had always made her feel like he could see straight through to her very core. "Yes," he said simply, "I did." She stopped walking. So did he. She turned to face him fully, letting out a slow breath. "Jonathan, I could have handled it." His jaw tensed slightly, the flicker of something darker flashing through his expression. "I know you could have. But you shouldn't have to." She swallowed, the weight of those words settling deep in her chest, sinking into places she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. She understood him completely, because this wasn't just about today. This was about every single time. Every time she had been dismissed, disrespected, devalued, forced to swallow her frustration, forced to choose between her dignity and her safety. Every time she had walked into a room and knew she would have to work twice as hard just to be considered half as capable. Every time she had been expected to take the high road, to let it go, to be the bigger person, to de-escalate, to back down, to let it slide, because to do otherwise meant risking everything she had built. She took a slow breath, then reached out, brushing her fingers against his hand, grounding herself in the feeling of him, solid, steady, unwavering. "I didn't want you to have to fight this battle for me." Jonathan's gaze remained locked onto hers, unflinching, unreadable. But then, finally, his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. "You didn't call me to fight it for you," he murmured. "You called me to witness it. To make sure they had nowhere to hide. And I made damn sure they didn't." Her fingers tightened slightly around his, something unspoken but deeply understood passing between them. For so much of her life, she had been standing alone. Even when she had allies, even when she had support, the weight of it had always felt like hers alone to carry. But Jonathan Jonathan had never let her carry it alone. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders slightly, forcing the last remnants of the encounter out of her body like a breath she no longer wanted to hold. "So," she said, tilting her head slightly, her voice lighter now, teasing, though not entirely free of exhaustion. "What now?" Jonathan's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Now." He let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Now, I make sure those two never wear a badge again." Camille nodded slowly, a small, satisfied smirk curling at the edges of her lips. "Good." Jonathan studied her for a long moment, then sighed, his hands resting on his hips. "Are you sure you still want to take this flight? You don't have to go today. We can push it back." Camille raised an eyebrow, the smirk growing. "You think a little racial profiling is enough to make me cancel a meeting?" Jonathan let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You are impossible. And yet, you married me anyway." His lips twitched, but the smile never fully formed. Instead, his expression softened, the sharpness in his gaze giving way to something quieter, deeper. He reached up, brushing his fingers lightly against her cheek, a rare public display of affection, one that sent another ripple through the crowd still watching, still whispering. "Be careful," he said quietly. "And call me the second you land." "I always do," she murmured, something warm settling in her chest. And then, just like that, she turned and walked away, her passport in hand, her head high, her dignity untouched. Jonathan watched her go, his gaze steady, unwavering. And as he turned, as he adjusted his cufflinks and straightened his suit, as he walked toward the exit with that quiet, deadly determination still lingering in every step, he was already thinking about the next steps. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And by the time he was done, Reynolds and Carter wouldn't just lose their jobs. They would lose everything. The aftermath of the confrontation at the airport was far from over. The world outside had continued moving, flights were still taking off, people were still rushing to their gates, announcements were still echoing through the terminal, but for the men who had stood on the wrong side of power that day, time had come to a grinding halt. Officer Reynolds and Officer Carter had spent years believing they were untouchable. That their badges, their authority, and the carefully maintained culture of silence and complicity that shielded men like them would always keep them safe. They had built their confidence on the assumption that their actions, no matter how unjust, how cruel, how undeniably racist, would always be backed by a system that had never truly held them accountable before. But that assumption had shattered. And now, they were the ones waiting for judgment. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, the incident had become a national headline. The footage from the terminal, captured by an onlooker's phone, had gone viral, played and replayed across every major news network, dissected on social media, analyzed by legal experts, debated by political commentators. The conversation had exploded, spilling far beyond the confines of that airport and into a broader reckoning about systemic racism, law enforcement abuse, and the unchecked power that so many officers still wielded with impunity. But the part that made it impossible to sweep under the rug? The part that made every attempt at damage control completely futile? It wasn't just any woman they had tried to humiliate. It was the wife of the United States Attorney General. Jonathan hadn't needed to say another word after leaving that terminal. He hadn't needed to make threats or issue ultimatums beyond what he had already said. Because by the time he walked out of that airport, the wheels of consequence were already in motion, set into place by forces much larger than two disgraced officers scrambling to cover their tracks. The Department of Justice launched an immediate internal review. The Office of Professional Responsibility within Homeland Security opened a separate inquiry. Every single one of their past complaints, every civilian report of racial discrimination, every case they had been involved in, it was all dragged into the light. And as expected, the truth was ugly. Reynolds had a history of targeting black and brown travelers for unwarranted detentions. Multiple reports filed against him for excessive force, verbal abuse, and falsified claims of suspicious behavior. Complaints that had been buried, dismissed, ignored. Carter, though younger, had already accumulated enough internal warnings that he should have never still been on duty. They had believed they were untouchable. Now they were drowning. It didn't take long before official suspensions were handed down. Publicly, the department issued a carefully worded statement, calling the incident deeply regrettable and promising a full review of screening procedures. Privately, there was panic. The airport's administration was scrambling. Higher-ups were desperate to avoid a lawsuit, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, desperate to salvage whatever credibility remained. But there was no salvaging this. Too much attention. Too many eyes. Too much undeniable proof. Camille watched it all unfold with quiet, measured detachment. She hadn't wanted a spectacle. She hadn't wanted her name plastered across every news outlet, her face appearing on every talk show discussing the realities of racism in America. She had spent years keeping herself out of the spotlight, doing her work in courtrooms and boardrooms, fighting battles where she knew she could win through strategy, not spectacle. But this had been forced onto her. And now, she refused to look away. She had stayed silent for too long. Had let moments of discrimination pass unchecked, unchallenged, unspoken, not because she hadn't wanted to fight, but because she had always known the cost of speaking up. But now, with the entire world watching, with every single person who had ever doubted her worth being forced to confront the undeniable truth of what had happened, she felt something shifting inside her. A realization. A choice. For years, she had believed that winning battles in silence was the best way to navigate the world. That her success, her presence, her undeniable excellence would be enough of a statement. That being in the room, taking up space, proving them wrong by simply existing at the highest levels was the best weapon she had. But now, standing in the aftermath of everything that had happened, she wondered if it had ever truly been enough. She wondered if she had spent too long playing by rules that had never been written for her. Jonathan had seen it in her eyes the night the first major news broadcast had aired the footage. He had sat beside her in their living room, watching as pundits debated the case, as people took to social media to demand accountability, as the entire country weighed in on what had happened to her. She hadn't said anything at first. Just sat there, watching. And then, softly, almost thoughtfully, she had murmured, "What if we took it further?" Jonathan had turned his head, studying her carefully. Further. She had met his gaze, something new burning in hers. What if we didn't just go after them? What if we went after the entire system that allows this to keep happening? Jonathan had been quiet for a long moment, then exhaled, nodding slightly. "I was wondering when you were going to say that." She had let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "You knew I would." Jonathan smirked, tilting his head slightly. "I know you. And I know you never settle for just one win when there's a whole damn war to fight." Camille had breathed out slowly, her mind already racing, calculating, strategizing. Because this wasn't just about two disgraced officers losing their jobs. It was about how many more just like them were still out there, untouched, unseen, unchecked. It was about how many people had been in her position before, alone, with no attorney general husband to call, no viral video to force accountability, no power to tip the scales in their favor. It was about the hundreds, the thousands, the millions of stories that never made the news. And she wasn't going to let it stop here. This wasn't just about what had been done to her. It was about what had been done to all of them. And by the time she was done, real change was going to happen. Because Camille Thompson had just been pushed too far. And now, she was about to push back harder than they ever could have imagined. The storm hadn't passed. If anything, it was just beginning. The media had latched onto the story with a relentless grip, turning it from a single incident into a full-blown national conversation. The footage had been analyzed from every angle, experts dissecting the interaction, discussing the deeply ingrained biases within law enforcement. Every detail had been exposed, the blatant profiling, the arrogance of the officers, the moment of reckoning when they realized who they had targeted. But this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about the millions of people who had been in Camille's position but had no camera to capture their truth, no attorney general husband to step in, no public outcry to demand justice on their behalf. And Camille? She wasn't interested in simply walking away with a personal victory. She wanted something bigger. She sat across from Jonathan in their home office, the space dimly lit, the weight of the day still settling in the air between them. The large mahogany desk that separated them was covered in papers, articles, legal briefs, and notes filled with plans that had begun forming the moment she realized this fight wasn't over. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. Camille exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against the edge of the desk. This doesn't end with their firings. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. No, it doesn't. Her jaw tightened slightly. We have a chance to do something bigger than just get rid of 2 bad officers. We have a chance to expose the entire system that allows them to exist unchecked. Jonathan watched her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're talking about a full-scale investigation. Camille met his gaze, her determination solidifying. I'm talking about legislation, lawsuits, internal reforms, actual systemic change. These men weren't anomalies, Jonathan. They were products of an environment that encourages this kind of behavior, that protects it, that enables it to keep happening. We both know if I hadn't called you, if that woman hadn't recorded it, if this hadn't blown up the way it did, they would have gotten away with it. Again. Just like they always have. Jonathan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You're not wrong. But you also know this won't be easy. Going after the system means going after a deeply entrenched network of power, influence, and bureaucracy. The same people who claim to support reform in public will fight against it behind closed doors. There's a reason nothing ever changes, Camille. Because they've made sure it stays that way. Camille's gaze didn't waver. Then we break it. Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. You really think we can? She leaned forward, her voice unwavering. I think we have to. Because if we don't, then nothing we've done means anything. If we don't push for change when we actually have the leverage, when we have the country's attention, then what was the point? Jonathan sighed, but there was something else in his eyes now. A spark. A recognition that she was right, that the window they had now was rare and fleeting. He had spent years inside the system, fighting for justice within its constraints, but he also knew that sometimes, those constraints were designed to keep true justice from ever being reached. He leaned forward slightly, his expression darkening. If we do this, we do it smart. We don't just go after 2 men, we go after every policy that protects them. Every loophole that lets them get away with it. Every person who has ignored the complaints, buried the reports, silenced the victims. But Camille, you have to understand something. She waited. Jonathan's voice was low, steady. If we go down this road, they will come for us. Politically, personally. They will try to discredit us, they will dig into every case you've ever worked, every move you've ever made. They will try to turn this against you, against me, against everything we stand for. Camille tilted her chin up, her voice like steel. Let them. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he smiled. It wasn't amusement. It wasn't relief. It was the smile of a man who had just decided he was all in. The next morning, the fight began in full. Within hours, Jonathan had personally called for a federal review of law enforcement screening policies, citing the blatant abuse of power witnessed at the airport. Camille had reached out to civil rights attorneys, policy experts, and activists, coordinating a strategic legal approach to ensure this moment didn't become just another fleeting headline. And Reynolds and Carter. Their fall was swift and brutal. The footage had already done its damage, but the deeper investigations into their past records revealed even more damning truths. Reynolds had been named in at least 8 misconduct complaints over the years, ranging from racial profiling to excessive force. Carter had been involved in multiple questionable detentions, one of which had resulted in an innocent man being jailed overnight under false pretenses. But the final blow came when it was revealed that their actions at the airport weren't just morally wrong, they were legally indefensible. Both officers had violated federal regulations on passenger screenings, directly contradicting established protocols. The argument of following standard procedure collapsed under scrutiny, especially when it was discovered that multiple black travelers had filed similar complaints against them in recent years, complaints that had been ignored, buried, or dismissed entirely. The public backlash was merciless. Their suspension became termination. Their termination became investigations. And the investigations led to charges. For the first time in their careers, they weren't the ones holding the power. They were on the other side of the system now. And there was no badge left to protect them. As Camille watched it all unfold, as she sat in the war room of their home, surrounded by lawyers, advocates, and reporters, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just victory. Not just satisfaction. Control. For so many years, she had navigated a world that constantly tried to put her in her place. That had forced her to be careful, to be cautious, to pick her battles wisely. But now, she was the one setting the terms. And the world was finally listening. The weight of everything that had transpired over the past few days hung thick in the air, stretching across the city like an approaching storm. Camille sat at the long, polished table in her home office, surrounded by papers, legal documents, and transcripts of interviews that were now making their rounds on every major news outlet. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, emails flooded in faster than she could respond, and yet, in the eye of the hurricane, she remained composed, steady, deliberate, unwavering. Across from her, Jonathan stood with his arms crossed, his gaze scanning the latest legal brief that had just been handed to him by one of his aides. His expression was unreadable, but Camille knew him well enough to recognize the silent calculations running through his mind. Every move they made, every statement they released, every action they took from this moment forward would be met with resistance, not just from the officers who had been disgraced, but from an entire system that was built to resist accountability. She exhaled slowly, setting her pen down as she finally spoke. "They're going to fight this with everything they have." Jonathan nodded, flipping through the pages with methodical precision. "Of course, they are. They don't just want to clear their names, they want to send a message. They want to remind everyone that men like them don't go down easily." Camille tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Are you worried?" He looked up, meeting her gaze with something dark, resolute in his expression. "I'm pissed." The sharpness in his tone wasn't directed at her, it was directed at everything they were up against. The phone calls from political figures urging them to be careful. The veiled threats from law enforcement unions. The smear campaigns that were already bubbling beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. Camille leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "We knew this was coming. We knew they wouldn't just accept defeat. But what they don't seem to understand is that I don't scare easily." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "That's the problem, Camille. They're terrified of you." She raised an eyebrow, amusement flickering in her gaze. "Good." Jonathan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before tossing the legal brief onto the table. "They've already started reaching out to the media, trying to twist the narrative. Claiming they were following proper procedure, that they're victims of a political agenda, that this is an attack on law enforcement itself." Camille exhaled, shaking her head. "Of course, they are. Because the moment accountability enters the equation, they stop being law enforcement officers and start being victims. It's the same playbook, over and over again. Jonathan tapped his fingers against the table, deep in thought. We have to control the conversation. We can't just respond to their attacks, we have to dictate the terms of this fight. If we let them frame this as a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of protocol, we lose. Camille nodded, already pulling up an email on her laptop. We go public first. We lay out the facts before they have a chance to muddy them. Every past complaint, every abuse of power, every violation of federal screening policies, we expose it all. Jonathan watched her for a moment, then smirked. You really want to burn it all down, don't you? She met his gaze, unblinking. I want to make sure they never do this to anyone else again. The room fell into silence, but it wasn't empty, it was charged, filled with the weight of what they were about to do. Camille had always known how to navigate these fights, measured, strategic, controlled. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. This was bigger than her. And she refused to let it slip through her fingers. A sharp knock on the door interrupted their conversation, and one of Jonathan's aides poked her head in. Sir, you're going to want to see this. Jonathan frowned, exchanging a glance with Camille before taking the tablet from her hands. The screen lit up with a live news broadcast, and the moment he saw who was speaking, his entire body tensed. Officer Reynolds. Dressed in his uniform, standing in front of a row of American flags, flanked by his lawyer and representatives from the police union. His voice was carefully controlled, his demeanor rehearsed, but the message was clear. He wasn't apologizing. He was doubling down. Law enforcement officers across this country put their lives on the line every day to protect the American people. We follow procedures, we uphold the law, and we do our jobs with integrity. But now, we are being vilified, our reputations destroyed, our families threatened, all because we dared to do what we were trained to do. Camille clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. Reynolds continued, his expression shifting into something almost pained, righteous. I never expected that simply doing my job would lead to a political witch hunt. That the highest levels of government would come after me, not because I did anything wrong, but because they wanted to make an example out of me. This isn't just about me, this is about every officer in this country who fears that one mistake will cost them their career. Jonathan let out a slow breath, shaking his head. He's playing the martyr. Trying to turn this into a war against police instead of what it actually is. Camille's eyes burned with frustration, but she didn't look away from the screen. She could already see the comments flooding social media, the people falling for it, defending him, turning this into another battle of law and order versus political overreach. Reynolds wasn't just fighting for his reputation. He was fighting to keep the system intact. And if there was one thing Camille knew about men like him, it was that they would burn the truth to the ground before they let themselves be held accountable. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to think, to plan, to stay ahead of them. We need to move faster. We can't just respond, we need to bury him in the facts before this narrative gets out of control. Jonathan nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll schedule a press conference. We go on record. No vague statements, no political safe answers. Just the truth, laid bare. Camille's mind was already spinning, working through the next steps, anticipating their next move, preparing for the inevitable escalation. Because this wasn't just about two disgraced officers anymore. This was about an entire machine fighting to protect itself. And Camille? She was about to tear it apart. The storm had raged for weeks, tearing through the media, legal institutions, and political landscapes like a force no one could ignore. What had started as an isolated incident at an airport security checkpoint had evolved into something far greater, a battle that shook the very foundation of power and accountability in law enforcement. Camille had known from the moment she stepped into that confrontation that she was fighting more than just two corrupt officers. She was fighting a system built to shield them. But now, the system was crumbling. Officer Reynolds and Officer Carter had lost everything. Their careers were not only over, they were publicly disgraced, their faces plastered across headlines that chronicled their years of misconduct. The official investigation uncovered more than enough evidence to bring charges against them. False reports, fabricated suspicions, deliberate racial profiling, it was all exposed, laid bare for the world to see. Reynolds had fought back with every desperate tactic in his arsenal, using the police union, media allies, and political connections to paint himself as a victim. But it wasn't enough. The truth was too damning. The public backlash was unrelenting. His former colleagues distanced themselves, his supporters dwindled, and soon, even those who had once defended him began to fall silent. He had been a man who thrived on power, on the untouchability of his badge. Now, he was just another name in a long list of disgraced officers. Carter fared no better. Unlike Reynolds, he lacked the connections and influence to fight back. His suspension became a permanent termination, his legal fees mounting as lawsuits from past victims surfaced, each one revealing the true scope of the damage he had caused. His once steady, secure career was now in ruins, and no police department would touch him. But Camille? Camille thrived. Her decision to go beyond personal justice had been the turning point. She hadn't just fought to punish two men, she had waged war on an entire system of protection and silence. The case had sparked a nationwide movement, leading to new policies on law enforcement accountability, racial profiling restrictions, and public oversight on officers with histories of complaints. She had been approached for interviews, panel discussions, even invitations to testify before Congress, her name now synonymous with the fight for true justice. Jonathan had stood beside her through it all, using every ounce of his power and influence to make sure their fight was more than just symbolic. Together, they had forced conversations that people in power had spent decades avoiding. They had dragged truth into the light, making it impossible to ignore. But Camille knew something deeper had changed. For years, she had believed in quiet victories, in working behind the scenes, in proving herself through sheer excellence rather than confrontation. But this fight had taught her something invaluable: some battles couldn't be won in silence. Some fights needed to be loud, unapologetic, relentless. She had spent her life breaking barriers, stepping into rooms where she was never meant to be, forcing her presence into spaces that had been designed to exclude people like her. But now, she wasn't just taking up space. She was redefining the very foundation those spaces were built on. She sat on the balcony of their home, a glass of wine in her hand, the city skyline stretched before her. Jonathan stepped out, rolling his sleeves up, exhaustion evident in his features, but there was something else there: pride. She glanced at him, smirking. "So, did we just start a revolution?" Jonathan chuckled, sitting beside her, exhaling deeply. "Looks like it." She took a sip of her wine, leaning back. "Good." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of everything settling, shifting, finding its place. There was still work to be done, there would always be work to be done. But for the first time in a long time, Camille felt something she hadn't let herself feel before. Not just vindication. Freedom. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. This story wasn't just about one woman standing up against injustice, it was about the countless people who never get the chance to fight back, who never get the chance to be heard. Camille's story was one of resilience, of power, of refusing to accept the way things have always been. But how many people face moments like hers without a voice, without support, without justice? We live in a world where power is often abused, where systems are designed to protect those who wield it instead of those who suffer under it. But change only happens when people refuse to stay silent, when they refuse to let injustice go unchecked. So ask yourself, what would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed quiet? Would you have walked away? Or would you have fought, knowing the odds were stacked against you? And more importantly, what will you do the next time you see injustice happening in front of you? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, then make sure you're part of the conversation. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let's keep talking about the things that really matter. And before you go, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist so you don't miss out on more stories that challenge, inspire, and make you see the world in a whole new way. Because the most powerful stories, they're the ones that stay with you.